everyone. My name is Lily, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian at Bathurst Clark Resource Library. So, on behalf of the Asian Heritage and Anti-Asian Racism Working Group, which includes Adam Tord, Bo, Ursula, and myself, as well as staff engagement, I want to welcome you all to today's training on racial literacy through an Asian Canadian lens. The goal of today's training is to increase our racial literacy and provide the knowledge, language, skills, and awareness to talk about and address race and racism. So at the end of the session, hopefully you will have an opportunity to reflect on your racial literacy while exploring fundamental vocabulary and concepts related to identity, race, and racism, and what it means to be an ally. So today's training will be facilitated by Sarah Long and Jennifer Vaughn. Here is a little bit more about the two facilitators. Sarah, who will be joining us a bit later, is a second-generation cisgender Chinese Canadian woman from Toronto. She's an experienced educator and a former equity consultant for the York Region District School Board. Sarah has a master's degree in leadership, policy, and change in equity and inclusive education from U of T. She is also the vice president of the Asian Canadian Educators Network, a non-for-profit organization that is focused on advocating for educational issues and concerns related to Asian Canadians. While Jennifer is the coordinator and member of the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, a non-for-profit advocacy group against anti-Asian racism and hate in Canada. The council invests in equity, diversity, and inclusion work to develop racial literacy and cultural consciousness to equip and empower Asian Canadians with knowledge and skills necessary to defy racism and become informed allies. So Jennifer will be facilitating the first part of this training, and now I will pass it on to her. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I am so excited to speak to you today and support your individual and collective learning. Thank you so much, Lily, for that introduction, and thank you to the Vaughn Public Libraries as well as this committee for bringing CCNC-SJ on board to bring you this workshop today, in which we are excited again to do it with you because this is a lifelong journey. And anti-racism work never ends, and so we're so happy that this is happening. This learning was intentionally developed to make connections with the roles you have and the work you do at Vaughn Public Library, so that through a lens of racial literacy from an Asian Canadian, you have another way to understand the experiences of your clients and to consider how you might want to support them. Before we begin, we want to pay our respects and gratitude to the Indigenous people on whose land we meet together, both in Vaughan, here in Toronto as well, to acknowledge them as stewards of this land from time immemorial and to recognize the long-standing history we have with this land and colonialism. There were hundreds of nations that had sovereign governments, families, rituals, ceremonies, and thriving cultures in which some of us here are very well familiar with our own heritage and our culture. With the thriving cultures before the first settlers arrived on Turtle Island, we must commit to centering Indigenous voices and telling the truth in history and the present. And we make this acknowledgement as part of our work as individuals and collective work to dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, recognizing that Canada is built on the practices of slavery, genocide, and land theft. And so in this workshop, as immigrant settlers or first, second generation racialized peoples, or also immigrants, we want to reflect on that, and we want to acknowledge that this history is a part of the fabric in how we view our politics and how we view society and our cultures and our heritage, and also how we interact with each other. So with that said, we want to make those connections to current world realities as we witness the ongoing violence of colonization resulting with an immense loss of lives. And additionally, I want to remind folks that what is happening in the States is not unique to their borders and that we must stay vigilant of hate and racism in Canada. I want to take a moment of silence for those that have been killed tragically, who have been injured, and who are displaced from nowhere safe to go or return. So just that moment, I would like to just give us just a minute of silence. Wonderful. Thanks for joining me in that moment of silence. I would like to begin our conversation in a way that seeks to honor who we each are on the inside. Using the prompts place, name, and intention, we begin the acknowledgement of place intentionally so that we are mindful of locating ourselves and acknowledging the land we are on as a beginning commitment to truth. And we know it has to continue far beyond this, as many of us are settlers on Turtle Island. We also begin the place to remind ourselves of the places and people we are connected to through our own ancestry. I am joining you all today from my home in Toronto, situated on the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Anishinaabe and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat people, a place where many, many nations, as I just named. When I think of this place, I am also very connected to my parents' homeland in Vietnam. Though I've only been there once, the link between my identity and culture is strong and is rooted to who I am. So as I'm speaking to you about my identity, I am also giving you the place, name, and intentions of my identity, in which you will be in the same rooms with individuals who also have these experiences or may have these experiences. And so by sharing mine, I hope that you can have some sympathy or empathy or some humility with how I am identifying myself and how I navigate in a group such as this. So my name is Jennifer Vaughn. That is a English name that I was given to me at birth when I was born. My parents were Vietnamese refugees, and they came here during the 90s and were sponsored by missionaries. The only way for us to get here was through a missionary program, which meant that we had to remove parts of our identity in order to ensure that we were modeling Canadian citizenship in ways that would help us assimilate a little better. But through that process, we unfortunately lost pieces of our identity, such as the fact that I no longer am able to use the name that was given to me by my parents, which is of Chinese descent. Unfortunately, that happened because not a lot of people could understand my name. People understood how it was constructed, the reasoning why it sounds the way it is. And so why don't we go for something a little easier? Jennifer. That was something that I had to deal with when I was growing up. And it was kind of interesting because between that and the household, I wasn't quite sure who I was and who I could be, whether I was a Canadian or a Chinese Vietnamese Canadian or separate. And with that, whatever I brought from my whatever I brought from school didn't match the type of heritage learning or household culture that would take in that kind of knowledge. For instance, the history of Canada, not knowing about the Indigenous people, not knowing about the land that we were on, was very dismissed in my education and learning. And so when I do this work now in recognizing those histories, I am able to connect more deeply with my parents' displacement and my purpose here, especially in my position in looking at the world politically, socially, and how I engage with others equitably. So with that story, my intention today is to be present, to facilitate with humility, and to keep at heart our work of shared humanity and responsibility in dismantling racism in all forms of oppression. So with that said, I'm actually going to put you guys in breakout rooms so that you may introduce yourselves to your colleagues in the very much the same way, get to know each other. We can't do this work if we don't know where we're all from, especially being mindful of the identities very similarly to mine or of other racialized folks in the room. Welcome back, folks. I hope you all enjoyed connecting with each other in a different way and that you learned something more about the colleagues you work with. And when we intentionally reflect on race within our own name place and intention, we realize that anti-racism work can be quite personal and that it's all a part of our stories. And we also recognize that these conversations can stop at a personal level. They must continue into our professional lives because racism permeates across systems, from education to housing to employment, healthcare, and so on. And racism impacts our ability to bring our whole selves with us into all spaces. So anti-racism work and conversations about race involves both head work and heart work. Head work is our understanding of anti-racism theory and research, pretty much the activities and the knowledge that we hope to share with you guys today, because our actions need to be informed by that research, by that knowledge. And the heart work, because it invokes deep emotions and we need to be able to navigate those emotions. Both the ones that are ours and the emotions of others may hold and bring forward. So for the next part, I'm going to just share some guidelines because we will be going into another activity. This will be a reflective journal. So while we share these spaces, knowing that these are the guidelines for our dialogue today. So a bit of housekeeping just to make sure we're all safe and sound. All right, so when you engage with each other through this session, we ask that you share the space and prioritize listening to understand. As experiences are revealed, focus on the impact of the actions rather than the intention. Remember to go beyond the stories and focus on the role of the system and structures. Be mindful of your own areas of privilege and positionality. We all have our own stories and experiences. Keep our dialogues focused on how we might dismantle these structures. It's not a space to debate whether these lived realities exist. We know that they do, and it has been well documented in many research reports. You can check that out on our website. Just going to throw that out there. And be willing to sit in struggle and uncertainty. We are here to process the dissonance together. Work together to maintain a braver space rather than a comfortable one. We ask that each of us here practice humility, acceptance, and dissonance in our time together as necessary values that ground us in the head and heart work of anti-racism. So before I continue, I want to recognize that when talking about race, the identities we hold elicit different emotions. This presentation looks at race and racism through an East Asian experience. For white and non-East Asian racialized people, this work may create discomfort, and we encourage you to hold steady, as we know the discomfort can lead to growth. We also recognize that this work can be triggering for East Asians and other racialized individuals with lived experiences of harm as a result of racism. If this happens and you are triggered, please do what is necessary, including stepping away and prioritizing your well-being and safety. If this is too much, you are so welcome to just step back. You don't have to fully attend, but you are so welcome to also provide us with the feedback to share with us what we can do better to ensure that your experience with that discomfort and that trigger is being met halfway, because that's our job. That's what we got to do. We're humans and we got to do that with each other. So if you ever feel that need, you can DM me privately and we can talk it out. As soon as Sarah gets here, we'll have a little more capacity as well to take on those questions if that's something that you guys want to do. All right, so the head and heart work of anti-racism is necessary, but that alone is not enough to drive change. We have collectively been called to action. So through the mandate of your organization, the Vaughn Public Libraries, thank you again for bringing us on board with the goals of equity and inclusion for all outlined in the VPL strategic plan. Our actions need to include changes that improve the lives of racially marginalized individuals of all ages, staff, and community. Our actions need to dismantle oppressive systems that have been purposefully designed to uphold racism. Today, we hope to not only discuss the problematic nature of these systems, but begin to work towards intentionally engaging in solutions-oriented work through action. Our learning goals today in today's session is for learning are to develop our racial literacy by understanding the intersections of power and race, and to build our vocabulary associated with racial discourse so that we have the individual and collective capacity to analyze racial systems and understand impact from different communities. To be proactive so that we can continue to affirm, validate, and celebrate diverse identities and experiences within our organization, and so that we can be responsive and have resources to support clients who are experiencing or impacted by racism. With our goal being racial literacy, it's important that we define the term racial literacy. Racial literacy is a set of practices to teach people how to recognize, respond, and to counter forms of everyday systemic racism. It emphasizes how to identify routine and systemic forms of racism and to develop strategies for combating it and for dismantling it. Our work today has three main components. The first is to engage with a scenario and explore where you are currently in, your capacity to see race. It's an opportunity for you to identify how you are making sense of it as an individual with your own identities and in your own experiences. So I ask that you engage very intentionally through your own personal and racial perspectives, experiences, and beliefs, and that you are respectful and mindful of the specific historical as well as contemporary and local and immediate racial context. Okay, so we're going to move on into the reflective journal. So at this time, I'm going to copy and paste the journal into the chat. You'll get a Google link. So if you're working off of Google Drive, you may want to make a copy. This journal is for you and only you. I'm also going to pop a Word doc just in case y'all want to keep it on your computers.
Perfect. Yeah, so thanks so much, folks. Welcome back. We know that engaging in that work of self-reflection is really important, and it's really powerful to have that time to do that thinking on your own, as much as it is also very powerful to do it together. So we're going to prompt you to head back into those breakout rooms with the same folks that you've already begun to get to know and build some relationship with. And we're going to ask you to begin to share a little bit your responses to that question. How does race and power shape the experiences of the individuals in the scenario you just read? So you'll have 10 minutes to collectively respond to that question together. And then we'll return, and you won't be asked to share. It's just a space for you to be able to engage in that act of critical and collaborative dialogue. Okay, so Jen, I'll pass it back to you to start the rooms, and everyone, you should be prompted. We'll see you back shortly. Thank you again for engaging in that. We know that, working on doing that individual work can sometimes feel a little bit different when then you have to be able to engage in that conversation with others. So before we continue, we want to take a few minutes to just give you a chance to participate in some reflection, because we want to be able to highlight the process and the feelings of engaging with this kind of a scenario, right? In these two different sort of positions, right? Individually and as a group. There's going to be 4 questions, and as you all respond, you'll be able to actually see anonymously what the collective response looks like. So the first question I want to ask you is, what emotions showed up when you engaged in the scenario independently? So just go ahead and type it in. It's going to pop up as a word cloud as you do that, and no one else will know what your response was. So some expressing disappointment, frustration, sadness, anger, dismay, empathy, right? Resignation. Right? Lots of disappointment. So as the words get bigger, it means that more of you are typing that in. So a lot of anger in there as well, right? And these are all very valid feelings, right? But we want to show the range of emotions that kind of go through, even just reading about and even thinking about sort of what's been happening in this scenario, okay? So now I'm going to shift to the next question. What emotions showed up for you when you were asked to discuss this scenario with your group? So how did you feel when you joined your group and you had to actually talk about what you noticed? Okay. Resonance, thank you. Comfortable, some frustration, some hopefulness, being some agreement with each other, some understanding. Acknowledgement of what's happening, some anxiety in there and talking about it, right? Some excitement maybe to be able to be discussing it. See the word understanding, agreement, getting bigger, anxieties getting bigger as well. Um, Passionate. Okay. Thank you for filling this in. And just so you know, the image of these words will be provided to your organization so you can come back to these. Okay. Okay. So did you know how to respond to this scenario? Okay, so A is no, not yet. B is I have an idea, but I don't feel confident about it. C is I know how to respond to disrupt the harm that is occurring. And D is other. And I just want to remind that this is anonymous, so no one can see. It's just collectively to see where you are at as a collective in, your sense of being able to support or handle these kinds of situations. So we've got a couple folks who are still, wanting to learn about it, so then maybe not knowing how to respond yet. We've got some folks sitting in the have an idea, but not necessarily feeling confident, and some folks who feel that they have the skills and have the language and know how to disrupt and respond to the harm that is taking place. Okay. Perfect. And the last question is, I identified what was happening as bullying, racism, anti-Asian racism, or I didn't know how to identify what was happening. Perfect. And so these different words show different clarities, right, of specificity with the context of what was happening. Perfect. Yeah, so thank you everyone for answering those poll questions. And our last question really focused on being able to identify what was happening in the scenario. And you saw that our answers varied, right? But it's important for us to unpack this and to understand why our responses may have differed, right? So there's this commonly used expression that that's just the tip of the iceberg. And this means that this is only what we can see, but then that really there's so much more that meets the eye, right? And so we know that an iceberg, in fact, actually runs very deep and it can go very often unnoticed. And so when we look at how racism operates, we know that it is actually also deeply entrenched into our institutions and our societies. And it's entrenched in very blatant ways. And it's also entrenched in ways that are not so clear and not so obvious. So the obvious or the generally socially unacceptable forms of racism are often referred to as overt racism. And so we would find these forms of racism above the water at the top of the iceberg. Okay, those are the ones that are easy to identify. We know what's happening. We can all sort of name it and see it. Okay. At the bottom of the iceberg represents the covert racism. And these are generally socially accepted and practiced forms of racism. So what that means is when we apply this to the scenario, we can actually notice that there are some overt acts of racism, but actually, so some of us may not have named this as anti-East Asian racism. But then when we examine how racism presents itself, 90% of racism is actually covert because it involves policies, procedures, practices, assumptions, stereotypes, biases, and powerful unexamined ideas. And this last part is really important, a powerful, unexamined idea. And it's powerful because of its impact. And it's unexamined because there's a lack of attention to it. And so then, therefore, racism is occurring and functioning within our institutions and has actually gone unexamined. And so on the next slide, you'll see when we do begin to examine the ways in which racism is enacted in our institutions, it can elicit very strong emotions which was identified in those poll questions by all of you, right? And these strong emotions can put us in a state of inaction where we witness a horrific injustice. It puts us in shock and confusion. And then we feel a strong emotional response. And we act based on these emotions, but only engage in performative ways. And then before long, we begin to feel guilty, we feel tired, and that leads us to inaction. It leads us to passivity and then to apathy. And this inaction cycle then becomes cyclical in nature, and it can actually lead us to keep witnessing acts of injustice without any intentional change. And these emotions may arise because we don't yet have those necessary skills, language, or deepened understanding to really engage with the situation. And so racial literacy gives us all an opportunity to develop these skills, right? The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And so part one of the quote highlights that we have actually all been impacted by racism. And part two of the quote, racial literacy gives us all the opportunity for agency to identify, to name, and to address racism, right? We all have that power. And so now we move to this next piece around thinking about some of our own emotions. So Dr. Howard Stevenson is an author of Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools, and he offers us a strategy to recast these emotions through 4 steps. So the 4 steps are to calculate, to locate, and to breathe. And so as we go through these, we want you to reflect on your own response to each of these 4 steps. And so I want to invite you to sort of, you can type your response into the chat so that way we can sort of get a sense of where everyone is at, okay? So to calculate means to identify on a scale of 1 to 10 how stressed you are in the moment. So take a moment and you can just think a little bit about that. So I know for myself, because I've done some learning already, I would say I used to be at like a 9 in the level of stress when I would engage in these kinds of situations. Now I'm closer to like a 3. It still gives me some anxiety and some stress, but I'm not as far along. So again, you can use the chat to drop what your number is on a scale of 1 to 10. Perfect. So I see some folks are feeling pretty at ease about it, not too stressed. Some folks are experiencing some higher stress, right? When we're dealing with these kinds of situations or coming across these situations. So thank you for being so open and honest and sharing that with us. The next point is to locate, which is to pinpoint the part of your body where you feel that stress. And we want you to be specific. So for me, I tend to feel the stress in my shoulders. And in those particular moments, I feel tightness in my chest. If you're comfortable, we want to invite you to also share because it impacts us differently, but it has a very lived feeling in our bodies that we don't want to ignore. We want to acknowledge those pieces. So others are in the chest as well, some in the brain, some in the heart, some feel it in the shoulders and the jaw. Some of us feel it in the gut or the back of our neck, okay, in the sternum. Thank you again for sharing those. The third one is to communicate, which is to recognize the self-talk that you may be doing during this experience. So it could sound something like, I can't handle this. This is too much for me. Or it could be something more positive, like, I just need to breathe. I think I can get through this. I need to take a stance. So just want you to think about, and again, if you're comfortable, you can drop it in the chat. If not, just reflect on what is the self-talk that was happening when you were engaging in that scenario independently, and what is the self-talk you were engaging in when you were asked to share. I see some folks sharing some of those, so telling themselves to listen, reminding themselves that that's important. So thank you for that. And so as we think about our stress level, as we locate where in our body we feel, as we think about that self-talk, the last step that is offered is to breathe. And that last step is actually to breathe and exhale very consciously. And so at this moment, we want to take a moment to practice that together, this last step, and just take 2 deep breaths together. So we're going to breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, and then exhale for 4 seconds. All right, so ready? Breathe in, breathe out, and just one more breath. Perfect. Thank you. And so this part here is, these 4 steps are really important. And what they do is they actually help us to reduce the stress we may experience when we're talking about racism. So that rather than our amygdalas being hijacked, which then makes us, sometimes unable to respond, instead, engaging in these and acknowledging what we're feeling and taking those breaths allow us to reflect on and then recast those emotions so that you're able to also then access what you know about racial literacy in order to respond and then to act. So that when those horrific injustices take place, we don't get overtaken by shock and confusion, as if, the fruit of systemic oppression is surprising. And instead, our emotional response will be marked, by empathy, by compassion, and that will lead us to reject performative allyship and instead move towards the real vigorous work. And so if guilt and fatigue try to settle in, these steps help us to recenter the needs of those who are yearning for liberation and to remember that inaction and passivity are really detrimental to justice and that apathy is the antithesis of unconditional love. So thank you again for paying attention to your body and engaging in those with us. And so with that, we're going to move into the next part of our work together, which is to deepen. So that is to really deepen our understanding of power and race. And that means to interrogate our own beliefs about our association and relationship to privilege and to power. Okay. And we're going to begin on the next slide by sharing a teaching from Dr. Bettina Love. And she says, theory does not solve issues. Only action and solidarity can do that. But theory gives you the language to fight, the knowledge to stand on, and the humbling reality of what intersectional social justice is up against. And in this teaching, Dr. Love speaks to the importance of theory in anti-racism work, which is the head work in anti-racism work. And so with that being said, we're going to move into the head work of building racial literacy because that means that will help us to develop the necessary vocabulary for us to be able to talk and engage in racial discourse. So we're going to start with the definition of social construct. And if you already know this, that's great. So it's when many aspects of our everyday experience are the consequence of implicit social agreements, institutional practices, or collective social action, rather than objective reality, and only exist within the context of such agreements, practices, or collective actions. Okay? And when we unpack this definition, the key thing to understand is that something that is socially constructed is not based on objective reality. It's actually based off of social agreements. And so that takes us to our next definition, which is race. And race itself is a social construct, right? Race is defined as ideas formed by society based on geographic, historical, political, economic, social, and cultural factors, as well as physical traits, even though none of these can legitimately be used to classify groups of people. And so that brings us to our next definition, which is the process of racialization. And this is where groups come to be socially constructed as races based on characteristics such as ethnicity, language, economics, religion, culture, and politics. And Ijomo Oluwa tells us in her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, that throughout our entire society, our politics, our education system, our infrastructure, anywhere where there is anywhere where there is a finite amount of power, influence, visibility, wealth, or opportunity, we actually can see the impacts of racialization. And this is why she urges us to commit to anti-racist work as we find the impacts of race and racialization everywhere in our society, including in ourselves. And so that is going to take us to a video. And in this video, we can see how the definitions of race have changed in order to serve the purpose of locking people of color into the bottom.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then, the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
So putting this video into context allows us to understand how these concepts have actually manifested across time, and also how they've been weaponized in the past and in the present. And so the racialization of individuals into socially constructed categories of race became justification for racism to be built into policies, into legislations and practices across different systems in society. And that has a context in the present. Right? So racism operates at an interpersonal level, and this is called interpersonal racism. Interpersonal racism occurs between individuals. Once private beliefs come into interaction with others, racism enters the interpersonal realm. And so some examples would include expressions of racial prejudice, hate, biases, bigotry between individuals. But racism also operates at a system level, and this is called systemic or institutional racism. And systemic racism are the patterns of behavior, the policies, the practices that are all part of the structure of an organization or of an entire sector that can disadvantage or fail to reverse the ongoing impact and legacy of the historical disadvantages experienced by racialized people. And both interpersonal and systemic racism are a result of white supremacy. And white supremacy is an ideology. Okay? It's an ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to those of racialized people and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And once in place, interpersonal and systemic racism serve to reinforce, to maintain and to uphold white supremacy, which then creates a cycle of racial injustice. And the purpose of white supremacy and racism is really about power. Power is a relational term that, it essentially characterizes one's ability to get what they want, right? It describes the relationship between people and communities, and it can really only be understood within the greater social, political, and economic contexts in which it operates. What power does is it allows one group to name and classify subordinate groups, and then to subject them to differential treatment. And so in the context of race, it's about, the white race holding and exercising power over racialized groups through ideological, political, social, cultural, and economic domination. Now, in the last couple of slides, we talked about the impact of race and racism, and we are entering through an East Asian lens. So we want you to consider the following, okay? So this visual, what it does is it asks us to consider the ways in which people's experiences of racism or privilege, including within any one racialized group, may actually be different and vary depending on the individual or the group's additional overlapping social identities. Because we are all made of multiple identities, and all of those experiences impact us all at once. We carry each of those identities with us into every space and every situation that we're in. And so as we consider the impacts of race, power, and intersectionality through the head work and the heart work, we also need to critically reflect on how we position ourselves and how we go beyond the head and the heart. And so we're going to show a video that provides us with an understanding of moving from allyship to co-conspirator.
I wanted to bring that back. What would it mean for us in 2019 to think about what it would mean to be an abolitionist and to be a co-conspirator? And in the book, I use James Tyson. Now, many people are not familiar with who James Tyson is. You know Bree Newsom. Bree Newsom was the young black woman who took that Confederate flag down in South Carolina 8 days after Dylann Roof went into the AME church. And I tell the story in the book because I think this is an important story because Bree Newsom and James Tyson did not know each other. There were some folks who got together and said, that flag is coming down. They said, and a black woman's gonna take it down. They taught Bree how to climb. They had Bree's bail money ready. And that morning, Bree Newsom and James Tyson were at an IHOP. They got the word, come take the flag down. Bree Newsom climbs up on the pole to take the flag down. Now, this is where the difference between an ally and a co-conspirator is. James Tyson, now there's a gate for the flagpole. James Tyson isn't standing like outside the gate. Okay, like Bree, they coming, Bree. Hey, Bree. No, James Tyson, he is inside. And then the police say, you know what? We can get her down. Tase the pole. James Tyson, because he wasn't here, he was here, said, okay. He put his hand on the pole. That white man at that moment understood why he was there. He put his hand on the pole, and he knew that the police would not tase that pole with a white man, healthy white man, right there. He saved her life. That's what it means to be an ally. You can stand out there, and allies know all the language. They read all the books. They come to the meeting with all the terms. Right? They read the report before you read the report. Right? I always say allies make black folks feel bad. Like, did you read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book? Like, damn, I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book. Like, you know, I've been busy being black. Right? So I didn't read the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book, but I know it's fire. Right? So they come and they know what we gonna do? They go, you like, how they left already? Where'd they go?
I'm gonna call it
I'm gonna call it Uber, right? So that's the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator. You know, and this is that back to that abolitionist, is to put something on the line for somebody.
Yeah.
Take a risk to see how to use your whiteness. And I tell folks all the time, whiteness is like a bank. And it just, your ATM card just replenishes itself. So spend it. As the kids say, cash out. Right, cash out. It's gonna come right back.
Dr. Bettina Love very clearly identifies in that video the difference between the two terms through the kinds of actions that we take, right? So our actions need to loudly oppose systems that uphold white supremacy and that enact anti-Asian racism, right? So just as, in her story, James Tyson understood his role with Renewsem, we must also ask ourselves, are we ready to put something on the line to dismantle anti-East Asian racism in our society and within the organization, as you might have seen it? And so we've really gone through a lot in the last little bit. I want to bring us back to why we're here. So first we engaged, we participated in a scenario, you thought about your response, you went into your own personal understanding of how to decode that scenario. Then we did some sustaining, where this is where we identified our emotions, we calculated, we located, we communicated, we took a moment to breathe so we could sustain and stay in that conversation, stay with that learning, not get hijacked. And then finally, we just deepened our understanding. It was so brief, but we deepened a little bit of our understanding of racial literacy with a focus on power, race, language, and the lasting impacts of systemic racism. And so we want to give you an opportunity now, and we're going to keep it short because we want to make sure we get to that last part. So we'll just focus on the we'll give a little bit of independent time, is we want to ask you to re-engage with the scenario. And this time what we're going to do is I'm actually going to drop a list of the words, the vocabulary words that were covered today. And as you review the scenario again, want to see if you could possibly consider, are any of those words can be added into your explanation or into your analysis. And as you're writing, just want to let you know that following this, we are going to unpack the scenario for you to show the complexity of all the things that are playing out. So I think we'll call folks back now. And then we will move ahead to do a little bit of that unpacking, right? So earlier, we talked about how racism can be both overt and covert. And as we unpack the scenario now to read the underlying racial context, we want to bring back this visual of the iceberg to help us understand what makes racism so pervasive. So in identifying and naming what is happening, we highlight our collective work to be attentive to powerful, to unconscious and unexamined ideas within our own analysis as we build our racial literacy. And so before we begin, because there's going to be a lot coming, we do want to ask you to keep in mind that this analysis is based on the understanding of broad patterns of anti-East Asian racism that is captured and documented in research and in research reports that we can share with you at a later time. Okay? Okay. So, so Mr. Yoshida and his grandson are walking to the library together, and he asks his grandson how his school day was in Japanese. And as they walk to the library, they pass a group of high school students sitting at the tables near the entrance. And the students start snickering loudly and say, "Me no speak English, eat chicken feet" to each other. The act of mocking Mr. Yoshida's accent and making fun of diverse cultural foods is an example of overt anti-Asian racism that is actually above the waterline. The comment, "Me no speak English," is an example of language discrimination, where English is assumed to be the dominant and superior language compared to others. So although Mr. Yoshida is fully fluent in Japanese, it isn't valued equally. And instead, he experiences social outcasting and exclusion. And the comment, "Eat chicken feet," is an example of racist stereotypes of Chinese culture and food as being disgusting. And when Mr. Yoshida looks over to the library staff sitting a couple meters away and their eyes meet for a moment, but then the staff continues to check the books onto the computer, the silence and inaction by the staff member signals to Mr. Yoshida that the racism he experienced will not be addressed and that he will not be supported if he speaks up. Thinking about the safety of his grandson, Mr. Yoshida then lowers his head and takes his grandson's hand and walks away. He sees the Lunar New Year table with the children's books displayed and quickly directs his grandson there. Another library staff approaches them excitedly and says, "We've curated a lot of books about Chinese New Year for customers to explore. Feel free to take a look." This is actually an example of a microaggression that is based on assumptions and biases that East Asian people are all from one particular East Asian community. And so while the intention of the organization is to celebrate diversity, ironically, this existing gap in understanding the vast diversity of Asian ethnicities and communities actually results in the erasure of histories, cultures, contributions, and knowledges of other East Asian communities. And Mr. Yoshida's grandson then says, "Well, these books are about Chinese New Year and we're Japanese." And the library staff pauses and responds, "Thanks for telling us. We'll look into that. For now, you can read one of these since your cultures are pretty much the same." The staff member is a South Asian female in this example. And so while she thanks the grandson for the information, her comment that Japanese and Chinese culture are pretty much the same actually perpetuates the misconception that Asian cultures are a monolith and that Asians are a monolith. She misses the opportunity to connect and to affirm the grandson's self-advocacy, and also misses the opportunity to reflect on her own areas of need in understanding diverse East Asian cultures. And even though she is South Asian herself, her comment indicates that she has also internalized racist ideas about other racially marginalized communities. The grandson now has witnessed both overt and covert incidences of anti-Asian racism being dismissed and ignored by adults with authority and at the library. So through these actions, or rather actually through the inactions, he internalizes the racist message that his identity and culture are less valued. And this may affect his sense of self and pride in his own identity if it continues to be uninterrupted. Shulin is reshelving books when a client approaches asking for help to find the book. After looking up the book in the system, Shulin directs the customer to the fantasy section and provides the aisle number and book code. A few minutes later, the customer returns visibly upset and steps between the bookshelf and Shulin. This is an example of physical intimidation. With a raised voice, he says, "You gave me the wrong directions and made me walk all the way over for no reason. Did you not understand what I said? I want to speak to someone who knows English." This is an example of racist language that is rooted in deficit ideology. The client assumes that an immigrant person or someone who is beginning to learn English is less intelligent or less capable. Another Chinese staff then starts walking over. The customer shouts that they refuse to work with another Chinese staff and that there are too many of them. This is an example of xenophobia. He then demands to speak to someone Canadian, which perpetuates the stereotype that Asian people are perpetual foreigners who never really belong and are merely being allowed to live in their host country. And at the same time, he reinforces the Canadian narrative built on white, cisgender, heterosexual, middle, upper class experiences. This customer in this example is a senior white male. The library manager approaches him and asks how she can help. She gets him to settle down and explains that the book was incorrectly updated as returned in the system and that the directions that Shulin gave him were actually correct. She thanks him for being understanding and helps him to sign out his book. The manager tries to stand up for Shulin by letting the client know that she gave him the correct instructions. And while this is an important step, she does not address the racist and xenophobic behavior that this client has enacted. And what that does is it misses an important opportunity to hold the individual accountable to his actions. The manager then turns to Shulin and apologizes for what happens. She tells Shulin that the library will not accept inappropriate behavior and suggests that Shulin register for a staff training called How to Deal with Abusive Customers so she can know how to respond next time. But Shulin is silent. And while the manager's intention is to empathize and support her staff, what actually happens is that she further enacts harm by placing the responsibility of disrupting racism back onto the victim, while there's a lack of accountability towards the person who is enacting it. As a white managerial leader with a position of authority, she holds multiple positions of privilege and power compared to her staff. While her position as a manager should mean that she supports and protects her staff and enacts policy, she, in this moment, has chosen to prioritize peace at the expense of her staff members' well-being and safety, and that perpetuates systemic racism. The manager senses that Shulin is still upset and reassures her that the door is always open if she needs to talk. And although her apology and offer to support is well-intentioned, it is actually performative in nature because there's no real action or commitment that has taken place to challenge systemic racism. The library manager in this example is a white woman from Australia who also has a slight accent when speaking English, and she immigrated to Canada 2 years ago. So as you can see, in any situation that might seem like what's on the surface, there is actually so much context that is happening below. And those powerful, unexamined ideas are layered and have multiple dimensions to them. And so when you think about what was it that you were able to name? And what were some things that maybe are next steps for us in our own learning journey and in our own journey of building racial literacy so that we have the language, the knowledge, and the skills to be able to name the complex experiences of racism as they occur in each of those situations? So I know that unpacking the scenario may have caused some heightened emotions. It is a lot and it can feel really overwhelming. And yet I also hope that there is an understanding of why our ability to analyze race and racism needs to be this thorough. Because we can address things, but we can only address what we can see and what we can name. I want to bring that slide back up to encourage us here to hold steady again, to practice these strategies and to make space for what's happening in your body so that moving forward, you can move ahead individually and collectively in this work. And so as the next slide will show, racial literacy is this ability to be able to read those underlying racial messages, to recast emotions in ways that move us into action, and to resolve situations using racial literacy skills to disrupt the practices and the behaviors that uphold white supremacy ideology and practices. And today, we know we did it very quickly, but we engaged in all three of those steps. I want to bring back our conversation to the opportunity that we have personally and collectively to dismantle systemic oppression. And at this point, I invite you to take a moment to consider where your own depth of understanding and your ability to identify how racism is operating is currently at. And that, again, can guide your personal reflection on next steps in your own learning in order to deepen your capacity to act as co-conspirators. And finally, I will close off with this quote that even though this personal anti-racism work is just one prong of the dismantling of white supremacy, it is incredibly important. Systems do not change unless the people who uphold them change, and each person is responsible for upholding the system. And so it is our responsibility within ourselves, our communities, our educational institutions to do the work that we can every day to create the change the world needs by first creating change within ourselves. And so we thank you for engaging in that work individually, that self-work. We thank you for engaging with each other, and we thank you for inviting us into your organization and knowing that it's such a joy for us knowing that organizations are taking up this work and that everyone has access to this learning and these conversations.